The fancy lights of Henderson's fine dining sparkled against the rain-streaked windows as the evening rush began to pick up. Inside, the air was filled with the gentle clinking of expensive silverware and the soft murmur of well-dressed guests enjoying their meals. The restaurant was known as the place where the city's elite came to see and be seen. Amy Chen had been working there for 3 years, and she knew every inch of the polished hardwood floors, every crease in the crisp white tablecloths. She wasn't just any waitress, she was the one regular customers asked for by name, the one who remembered that Mr. Thompson was allergic to shellfish and Mrs. Rodriguez always wanted extra lemon with her tea. That rainy Tuesday evening started like any other. Amy was arranging fresh flowers on table 12 when she heard the heavy front door creak open. The sound of rain grew louder for a moment, then faded as the door swung shut. She looked up, and what she saw made her pause. An elderly black man stood in the entrance, water dripping from his worn coat onto the expensive carpet. His shoes were scuffed, and his hands, she noticed they were trembling slightly, clutched an old hat. The other guests began to stare, their conversations dropping to whispers. Some even pulled their designer bags closer, as if protecting them. The host, Robert, stepped forward with that particular smile Amy had come to recognize, the one that meant he was about to turn someone away. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked for the evening," he said, despite the clearly visible empty tables by the window. Something in the old man's eyes made Amy's heart twist. They weren't angry or demanding, just tired, so tired, and filled with a dignity that all the expensive suits in the room couldn't match. Before she could stop herself, she was walking towards the entrance. "Actually," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "table 7 just opened up. I'd be happy to seat this gentleman." She met Robert's shocked stare with a calm smile, then turned to the elderly man. "Right this way, sir." She could feel her manager's disapproving eyes burning into her back as she led him to the table. The man moved slowly, but with a careful grace that spoke of someone who had carried himself with pride through far worse than disapproving stares. As she held out his chair, he looked up at her with those gentle eyes. "Thank you, young lady," he said softly. "But I should probably tell you, I only have enough for a cup of coffee." His voice was rich and warm, like honey over gravel, carrying a hint of embarrassment but no shame. Annie felt something stir in her chest, the same feeling she got when she used to help her grandfather read his morning newspaper before his eyesight got too bad. Without hesitation, she leaned in slightly and spoke in a quiet, confidential tone. "You're in luck, sir. We're actually running a special promotion today for our first-time guests." It wasn't exactly a lie, she told herself. There was always some kind of promotion running at Henderson's, just not usually the kind she was about to create using her employee discount. The man's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, she caught a glimmer of something in his expression, surprise, certainly, but also something else she couldn't quite read. "Is that so?" he asked, and she could have sworn the corner of his mouth twitched upward just slightly. "Yes, sir," she replied, already planning how she'd handle the discount in the system. "Our chef's special tonight includes the roasted chicken with seasonal vegetables, fresh bread, and your choice of soup or salad. It comes with coffee too, of course." She named their most comforting dish, one that reminded her of Sunday family dinners. As she described the meal, she watched his face. There was such grace in the way he sat there, such quiet strength. When was the last time he had a proper hot meal? The thought made her throat tight. "That does sound wonderful," he said finally, his voice soft but clear. "I would be honored to try the chef's special." As Annie walked back to the kitchen to place his order, she could hear the whispers following her. She caught snippets of conversations. "Can you believe they're letting him stay? This place isn't what it used to be." She held her head high and ignored them all. She didn't care about the whispers. She didn't care about the way her manager was scowling at her from across the room. All she cared about was the way the old man's hands had stopped trembling when she treated him like what he was, a human being worthy of respect and kindness. What she didn't know then was that this simple act of kindness, this decision to see beyond appearances and treat someone with dignity, was about to change not just her life, but the lives of countless others. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, she simply focused on making sure the kitchen would prepare his meal with the same care they gave to their wealthiest guests. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. And sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about grand gestures, it's about small acts of kindness in a world that often forgets to be kind. Emmy hurried to the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew what she was about to do could get her in trouble, but something deep inside told her it was worth the risk. The kitchen was alive with its usual chaos, the clatter of pots, the sizzle of pans, and Chef Wilson's voice calling out orders. "One chef special," she called out, sliding the order into the queue. "Extra care on this one, please." The kitchen staff knew Amy well enough to recognize when she was serious about something. Chef Wilson caught her eye and gave a slight nod. He might be strict about his kitchen, but he had a good heart under that stern exterior. While waiting for the order, Amy prepared a basket of fresh, warm bread. She picked out the softest pieces, still warm from the oven, and added an extra pat of butter. The simple act reminded her of her grandmother, who always said you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated others during mealtime. Back at the table, the elderly gentleman, who had introduced himself as Mr. Washington, sat quietly observing the room. His posture was perfect, his weathered hands folded neatly on the table. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with his worn clothing, a certain poise, a watchful intelligence in his eyes. "Here's some fresh bread to start with, sir," Amy said warmly, placing the basket on the table. "Would you prefer soup or salad with your meal?" Mr. Washington looked at the bread basket as if it were made of gold. "Soup would be wonderful," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of emotion he couldn't quite hide. "It's been quite cold outside." Amy felt her throat tighten. How long had he been out in that rain? She hurried to get his soup, a creamy potato and leek that was one of the kitchen's specialties. As she placed it before him, she noticed his hands trembling slightly again, but this time with what seemed like anticipation. From the corner of her eye, she could see her manager, Mr. Peterson, watching her like a hawk. His face had that pinched look it got when he was particularly displeased. Other customers were still stealing glances at Mr. Washington's table, some with obvious disapproval, others with curiosity. But Amy focused on her guest. She watched as Mr. Washington carefully unfolded his napkin and placed it in his lap with the practiced ease of someone who knew proper dining etiquette. There was that contradiction again, the worn clothes but perfect manners, the humble demeanor but dignified bearing. When he took his first spoonful of soup, his eyes closed briefly, and Amy saw something that made her heart both soar and break at the same time, a single tear rolling down his cheek. He quickly dabbed it away with his napkin, but she had seen it. "Is everything all right with the soup, sir?" she asked softly, though she knew it wasn't about the soup at all. "My dear," he said, looking up at her with those kind eyes, "this is the first hot meal I've had in 3 days. And you're the first person who's looked me in the eye since Monday morning." His voice was steady, but filled with an emotion that made Amy's own eyes water. She busied herself adjusting the silverware to hide her reaction. "The main course will be out shortly," she managed to say. "Please let me know if you need anything else." Throughout his meal, Amy kept a protective watch over his table. She noticed how some other servers walked by with their noses in the air, how certain customers made a show of requesting tables far from his. But she also noticed other things. The young couple at table 9 who smiled warmly in his direction, the little girl at table 4 who waved at him and received a grandfatherly wave in return. When the chicken arrived, perfectly roasted with herbs and seasonal vegetables, Mr. Washington's face lit up with such genuine appreciation that Amy felt all her worries about using her employee discount melt away. She made sure his coffee cup stayed full, brought extra napkins without being asked, and treated him with the same attention she would give to the restaurant's most valued customers. Because that's what he was to her, valued. Not for his clothes or his wallet, but for his humanity. For the way he said thank you after every small gesture, for how he ate each bite with graceful appreciation, for the dignity he maintained, despite the obvious discomfort of some around him. As he finished his meal, Amy noticed he had cleaned every plate, soaking up the last bits of sauce with his bread in a way that spoke of someone who knew not to waste food. When she brought his coffee for the last time, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and assessment. "Young lady," he said quietly, "you've done more than serve a meal tonight. You've restored an old man's faith in humanity a bit." He reached into his worn coat pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, enough for a cup of coffee, just as he'd said. I know this isn't nearly enough for what you've provided, but it's all I can offer today, along with my sincere thanks. Amy felt tears threatening again but maintained her professional smile. Sir, remember the promotion? Your meal has been taken care of. Those bills will cover your coffee perfectly. She couldn't bear to take his last few dollars, knowing they might be needed for something more important. As Mr. Washington stood to leave, she noticed he stood straighter than when he'd arrived, as if the warm meal had renewed more than just his body. He put on his old hat, nodded gracefully to her, and walked toward the door with slow but steady steps. What Emmy couldn't know, was that her simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of many others. But for now, she simply watched him disappear into the rainy night, hoping he had somewhere warm and dry to go. Later, as she cleared his table, she found a small note written on a napkin in elegant handwriting. Kindness, when the world expects none, is the truest test of character. Thank you for passing that test with flying colors. She carefully folded the napkin and put it in her pocket, not knowing it would soon become one of her most treasured possessions. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Emmy pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders as she walked into Henderson's fine dining for her usual morning shift. Something felt different today. There was a tension in the air that made her stomach twist with worry. As soon as she walked through the staff entrance, she knew something was wrong. The usual morning chatter in the break room died as she entered. Her co-worker Mai quickly looked away, busying herself with her locker. Even Chef Wilson, usually ready with a gruff but friendly morning greeting, wouldn't meet her eyes. Ms. Chen. The sharp voice of Mr. Peterson, the manager, cut through the uncomfortable silence. My office. Now. Amy's heart sank, but she held her head high as she followed him. The click of his office door closing behind her sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. Through the window, she could see the early morning delivery trucks arriving, life going on as usual outside, while her world was about to shift on its axis. Sit down, Mr. Peterson said, his voice clipped. He wasn't looking at her, instead focusing on his computer screen. The security footage from last night was playing silently. Annie could see herself seating Mr. Washington, serving him, using her employee discount at the register. Would you like to explain this? Mr. Peterson finally looked at her, his face set in hard lines. Amy sat straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. I helped someone who needed a meal, sir. I used my employee discount too. To give away a full meal to a vagrant, he cut in. Do you know how much that meal cost the restaurant? Do you understand what you've done to our reputation? Mrs. Carlton Smith was quite upset about having to dine in the same room as, well, he gestured vaguely at the screen. He wasn't a vagrant, Emmy said quietly but firmly. He was a customer, a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity. The employee discount, Mr. Peterson continued as if she hadn't spoken, is for your meals only, not for you to play charity worker. It's clearly stated in the employee handbook. Section 4, paragraph 3, if you care to look it up. Emmy felt a strange calm settle over her. I know what the handbook says, sir. I also know what's right. What's right? Mr. Peterson's laugh was short and harsh. What's right is following policy. What's right is protecting our establishment's reputation. What's right is understanding that Henderson's fine dining has a certain standard to maintain. He pulled out a form from his desk drawer. She could see the words termination notice at the top. Her heart began to race, but she kept her face neutral. This was her livelihood they were discussing. Her rent was due next week. Her younger sister's college textbooks needed to be paid for. You've left me no choice, Ms. Chen. Your actions last night showed a complete disregard for company policy and the reputation of this establishment. I can't have someone with such poor judgment representing Henderson's. As he spoke, Amy's hand unconsciously went to her pocket, where Mr. Washington's napkin note still rested. She thought about his dignified bearing, about the tear that had rolled down his cheek at a simple bowl of soup, about how some things were worth more than a paycheck. You'll need to clear out your locker immediately, Mr. Peterson was saying. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you, minus the cost of last night's unauthorized discount. Amy stood slowly, her legs feeling slightly unsteady but her spine straight. May I say something, sir? He looked surprised but nodded curtly. 3 years ago, when I started working here, you told me that Henderson's was all about creating memorable dining experiences. Last night, I did exactly that. I created a memorable experience, not just for Mr. Washington, but for everyone who saw what happened. Maybe not the kind of memorable you wanted, but the kind that matters. Mr. Peterson's face reddened. That's quite enough, Ms. Chen. Please collect your things and leave the premises. The walk to her locker felt like a dream. Her co-workers whispered and stared, but no one spoke to her directly. As she packed up her few belongings, a spare pair of shoes, some bobby pins, a cardigan for when the dining room got too cold, she thought about how quickly 3 years of dedication could be erased. Chef Wilson appeared as she was closing her locker for the last time. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then pressed a small paper bag into her hands. Last night's soup, he muttered gruffly. Can't serve it today anyway. Before she could thank him, he had disappeared back into his kitchen. Outside, the morning rain had started again. Amy stood under the restaurant's awning, clutching her small box of belongings and Chef Wilson's soup, wondering what she was going to do next. The rent wouldn't pay itself. Her sister's textbooks wouldn't magically appear. The practical part of her brain was screaming about bills and responsibilities. But when she reached into her pocket and touched that napkin with its carefully written message about kindness, she couldn't bring herself to regret what she'd done. Some prices were worth paying. Some stands were worth taking. As she stepped out into the rain, she noticed a few regular customers arriving for their breakfast meetings. They looked at her curiously, standing there with her box of belongings, but quickly looked away when they realized she was no longer part of the restaurant's carefully crafted atmosphere. Amy took a deep breath and started walking. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she was walking in the right direction, away from a place that would punish kindness, away from a system that valued appearance over humanity. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that at that very moment, in a well-appointed office across town, an elderly gentleman in an expensive suit was making a phone call that would change everything. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, she just walked, head held high, carrying her box of memories and a warm container of soup into an uncertain but somehow hopeful future. The following day was a blur of job applications and worried calculations. Amy sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by newspaper classifieds and printouts from job websites. Her laptop showed too many tabs of restaurant positions, each promising less than what she'd made at Henderson's. The napkin with Mr. Washington's message sat beside her coffee cup, a reminder that doing the right thing sometimes came with a price. Her phone buzzed, another text from her sister about the textbooks. Amy closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She'd figure something out. She always did. The morning news played quietly on her small TV, mostly background noise as she circled another potential job in red pen. A story about local traffic gave way to business news, and she was about to turn it off when something made her freeze. Breaking news from downtown, the reporter announced. A crowd has gathered outside Wilson and Associates law firm, where renowned civil rights attorney and business owner James Washington Sr. is about to make an announcement. The coffee cup slipped from Amy's hand, splashing across her carefully organized job listings. She barely noticed. On the screen, standing on the steps of one of the city's most prestigious law firms, was Mr. Washington, but not as she had known him. Gone were the worn clothes and scuffed shoes. Instead, he wore an impeccably tailored navy suit. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture was exactly as she remembered. Dignified, commanding, but somehow still kind. He looked like what he apparently was, a man of power and influence. Amy scrambled to turn up the volume as Mr. Washington stepped up to the microphones. The crowd of reporters fell silent. For the past month, he began, his voice just as warm and rich as she remembered, but now filled with authority. I have been conducting an investigation into discriminatory practices at various establishments in our city. As someone who fought for civil rights in the courts for over 4 decades, I believe the fight for dignity and equal treatment never ends. Amy sank slowly onto her couch, her legs suddenly weak. The job listings lay forgotten, coffee soaking through them. Last night, Mr. Washington continued, I visited Henderson's fine dining. A murmur went through the crowd. I went dressed as someone they might consider undesirable. His smile held a hint of sadness. The response was, unfortunately, exactly what I expected, with one remarkable exception. The world seemed to tilt sideways as Amy watched him pull something from his pocket. It was a napkin, a Henderson's napkin. Her heart stopped. A young waitress named Amy Chen showed me what this city could be, what it should be. While others saw someone to dismiss, she saw a human being. When I could only afford coffee, she found a way to provide a meal with dignity. And now, I've learned, she has lost her job for that simple act of kindness. Cameras flashed. Reporters called out questions. Amy's phone started buzzing with text messages from former co-workers who were watching the same broadcast. The law firm of Wilson and Associates will be filing a discrimination lawsuit against Henderson's Fine Dining, Mr. Washington announced. But more importantly, we will be launching a new initiative, the Dignity Project. This foundation will work to create spaces where everyone, regardless of their appearance or economic status, can be treated with respect and kindness. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. And Ms. Chen, if you're watching this, we would be honored to have you join us in this endeavor. Your actions last night proved that one person's courage to do what's right can spark meaningful change. Amy's phone was ringing now, numbers she didn't recognize. Her social media notifications were exploding. Through her window, she could see her neighbor Mrs. Kim pointing at her apartment while talking excitedly on her phone. But Amy barely registered any of it. She was thinking about her grandmother's words from years ago. Sometimes the biggest blessings come disguised as trials. She'd said it when Amy's family had first immigrated, when everything seemed impossible and overwhelming. The reporters were shouting questions now. Mr. Washington, what's the estimated value of your business holdings? Is it true you own half the commercial property downtown? How long have you been planning this investigation? Mr. Washington held up his hands for quiet. What matters isn't my net worth or my properties. What matters is that last night, when I was at my most vulnerable, or appeared to be, one person chose kindness over convention, humanity over rules. That's the spirit this city needs. That's what we'll build on. He went on to outline plans for the foundation, programs to help small businesses practice inclusive service, scholarships for underprivileged students, community dining spaces where everyone would be welcome. But Amy was no longer listening. She was looking at the napkin on her table, now rescued from the spilled coffee. Kindness, when the world expects none, is the truest test of character. The words took on a whole new meaning now. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a crisp business suit holding a folder with the Wilson and Associates logo. Amy took a deep breath and smoothed her shirt. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob, but her heart was steady. Something told her that opening this door would change everything. But then again, hadn't everything already changed the moment she decided to seat a seemingly homeless man at table 7? She opened the door to her future, wondering what her grandmother would say about blessings in disguise now. The woman from Wilson and Associates introduced herself as Ms. Lee, head of community outreach. She sat at Amy's small kitchen table, seemingly unbothered by the coffee-stained job listings scattered about. Mr. Washington would like to meet with you personally, she said, her voice warm and professional. He has quite a story to share. 2 hours later, Amy found herself walking into one of the city's most prestigious office buildings. Her reflection in the polished marble floors showed someone who looked a bit overwhelmed, still wearing the same simple outfit she put on for job hunting. The security guard smiled at her, though, world of difference from the looks she'd gotten clearing out her locker at Henderson's yesterday. Mr. Washington's office was not what she expected. Instead of the intimidating space she'd imagined, it was warm and welcoming, with walls lined with photographs showing his journey through the civil rights movement. She recognized a few iconic moments from her history textbooks, and there he was, younger but with that same dignified bearing, standing alongside other brave souls who'd fought for change. Amy. Mr. Washington rose from behind his desk, now the picture of a successful attorney and businessman, but his eyes held the same kindness she'd seen at table 7. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss. As she sat in one of the comfortable leather chairs, he walked to a wall of photographs. Do you see this one? He pointed to a black and white image of a lunch counter. 1963. I was a young law student, and I was denied service at a restaurant much like Henderson's. The owner said someone like me would drive away his real customers. Emmy's throat tightened as she looked at the younger version of Mr. Washington, standing proudly despite the hate surrounding him. That day changed my life, he continued. I decided to become a civil rights attorney. Won some cases, lost others, but always kept fighting. Made some good investments along the way, built some businesses. But I never forgot what it felt like to be seen as less than human because of how I looked or what was in my wallet. He returned to his desk, pulling out a familiar napkin, the one with his message about kindness. Last month, my granddaughter told me about being ignored at an upscale boutique. Seems some things hadn't changed as much as we hoped, so I decided to conduct a little experiment. The restaurant visits, Emmy said softly, understanding dawning. Exactly, he nodded. I visited 15 high-end establishments in the city, dressed as someone they'd rather not serve. The results were disappointing. Until last night. His eyes crinkled with warmth. Until you. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Bring in the files, please. Ms. Lee entered with a stack of folders, laying them out on the desk. Each one was labeled with a restaurant name. Emmy caught glimpses of photographs, written reports, and what looked like legal documents. We've documented everything, Mr. Washington explained. The different treatment, the excuses for denied service, the subtle and not so subtle discrimination. Henderson's wasn't the worst, but it was bad enough. Except for you, Emmy. You were the only one in any of these establishments who treated me like a human being worthy of dignity. Emmy watched as he opened the Henderson's folder. Inside were photos taken from angles she hadn't noticed, Mr. Peterson turning away other customers who didn't fit the restaurant's image, notes about selective enforcement of dress codes, statements from former employees about unwritten rules for maintaining standards. Your act of kindness didn't just provide me with a meal, Mr. Washington said quietly. It provided us with the perfect contrast, proof that treating people differently was a choice, not a necessity. While your manager was busy protecting the restaurant's image, you were protecting something far more valuable, basic human dignity. He leaned forward, his expression serious. But now comes the hard part. We're going to make this public. All of it. The lawsuit against Henderson's is just the beginning. We'll be pushing for citywide changes in how businesses treat people. It won't be easy. There will be pushback. People don't like being shown their own prejudices. Annie thought about her former co-workers, about Chef Wilson's quiet act of kindness with the soup, about all the times she'd seen people treated differently based on how they looked or what they could afford. What can I do to help? Mr. Washington smiled, a full, warm smile that transformed his whole face. I was hoping you'd ask. We're not just filing lawsuits. We're building something new. The Dignity Project will create spaces where everyone is welcome, train businesses in genuine hospitality, provide opportunities for people who've faced discrimination. And we need someone who naturally understands what true service means, someone who sees people, not appearances. He slid a document across the desk. Annie looked down at the title, Director of Training and Community Relations. This is, she trailed off, overwhelmed. A job offer, he finished. One that pays considerably more than Henderson's, I might add. But more importantly, it's a chance to turn one moment of kindness into lasting change. Through the office windows, Andy could see the city stretching out below, the same city where she'd been fired just yesterday, the same streets she'd walked looking for new jobs. Now she was being offered a chance to help reshape it. There's something else you should know, Mr. Washington added, his voice gentle. Your sister's college textbooks. They're taken care of. Consider it back pay for last night's dinner. Annie felt tears welling up but blinked them back. This wasn't charity. This was recognition of worth, an opportunity earned through staying true to her values. When do I start? She asked, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Washington's face lit up with that same warm smile she'd seen at table 7. I believe you already did, last night, when you decided that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearances. As they shook hands, Amy noticed a new photograph on his wall, one she hadn't seen before. It showed table 7 at Henderson's, with Mr. Washington sitting there in his worn clothes, and her serving him with the same care she'd give any guest. She hadn't even noticed anyone taking pictures. That one, Mr. Washington said, following her gaze, is going in the foundation's main lobby. Sometimes people need to see what kindness looks like in action. Emmy looked at the picture and saw not just a waitress serving a customer, but a moment when staying true to one's values could spark real change. The journey ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. After all, she'd already taken the hardest step, choosing kindness when it wasn't the easy choice. The news about Henderson's fine dining spread like wildfire through the city. Local news stations camped outside the restaurant, hoping to catch comments from the management. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of discrimination at high-end establishments. The napkin with Mr. Washington's message became a symbol shared thousands of times online. Annie watched it all unfold from her new office at the Wilson & Associates building. Her desk faced the window, offering a view of the very street where she'd walked job hunting just days ago. On her desk sat a framed copy of that famous napkin, a reminder of how quickly life could change. "Turn on Channel 5, Ms. Lee said, poking her head into Amy's office. "They're about to announce the settlement." The television mounted on the wall showed the steps of the courthouse. Mr. Peterson, looking significantly less confident than when he'd fired Amy, stood with Henderson's lawyers. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Henderson himself, had flown in from his vacation home to handle the crisis. "Henderson's Fine Dining has agreed to a comprehensive settlement," the lawyer announced, reading from a prepared statement. "The restaurant acknowledges past discriminatory practices and commits to immediate and substantial changes." Amy leaned forward, listening as the terms were outlined. The settlement went far beyond what anyone had expected. A complete overhaul of restaurant policies, mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a new community outreach program, regular audits to ensure compliance, a significant financial contribution to the Dignity Project. But the most surprising part came next. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, Henderson's Fine Dining will be implementing a new program called Community Table. One night each month, the restaurant will serve a 5-course meal to guests from local homeless shelters and low-income housing communities, free of charge. Emmy felt tears welling up. She thought about Mr. Washington sitting at table 7, about how a simple meal could restore someone's dignity. The office door opened and Mr. Washington walked in, his face glowing with satisfaction. "Well, what do you think of that, Emmy?" "It's amazing," she said honestly. "But will they really change? Or is this just for show?" He sat down in one of her visitor chairs, his eyes twinkling. "That's where you come in. Your first project as Director of Training will be overseeing Henderson's staff transformation. Who better to teach them about true hospitality than the person who showed them what it means?" Emmy's eyes widened. "Me? Go back there?" "Not as a waitress," he clarified. "As an expert, a leader. Someone who can help them understand that real class has nothing to do with fancy clothes or expensive wine lists. It's about how you treat people." Before Emmy could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Chef Wilson, saw the news. "The kitchen staff wants you to lead our first training session. We're ready to learn." Mr. Washington noticed her smile. "Looks like you already have some allies in there." "Chef Wilson," Emmy explained. "He gave me soup the day I was fired. I think he understood even then." "Good people often do," Mr. Washington nodded. "They just need someone to show them it's okay to act on their better instincts." Later that afternoon, Amy stood in front of Henderson's again. The protesters who'd been there earlier were gone, replaced by workers installing a new sign. "Under new management. Everyone welcome." Inside, the dining room was empty, closed for renovations and staff training. The crystal chandelier still sparkled, the white tablecloths still gleamed, but something felt different. Maybe it was the absence of that supple tension she'd always felt, the unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. Mr. Peterson was waiting in the lobby, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching humility. "Miss Chen," he said stiffly, "we look forward to learning from you." Emmy thought about how easy it would be to enjoy this moment of revenge, to make him feel small the way he tried to make others feel small. Instead, she smiled genuinely. "I look forward to working with all of you. When we know better, we do better." The kitchen door swung open, and Chef Wilson emerged with his entire staff. They'd taken off their white coats, showing they were here to learn, not to work. Some looked uncomfortable, others eager, all uncertain about what came next. "Today," Annie began, her voice clear and confident, we're going to redefine what fine dining means. It's not just about the food or the atmosphere, it's about making sure every single person who walks through that door feels valued. She caught sight of her reflection in one of the dining room mirrors, no longer a waitress in a plain black uniform, but a professional in a business suit. Yet she was still the same person who'd chosen kindness over rules that night at table 7. The first thing we need to understand, she continued, is that dignity isn't something you earn with a credit card limit or designer clothes. It's a basic human right. From the back of the room, Mr. Washington gave her an encouraging nod. He traded his expensive suit for simpler clothes today, looking more like he had that rainy night. A reminder that appearances didn't define worth. As Annie began the training session, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. She'd been fired for treating someone with dignity, and now she was being paid to teach others to do the same. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways. But this wasn't just about justice, it was about transformation. About proving that change was possible, that it was never too late to choose a better way. As she looked at the faces of her former co-workers, now her students, she saw the same potential for change that Mr. Washington had seen in Henderson's itself, not just a place serving meals, but a place serving hope, one table at a time. 1 year later, Emmy stood in front of a converted warehouse in the heart of downtown. The morning sun caught the gold letters on the glass doors. The Welcome Table, a Dignity Project restaurant. Her heart swelled with pride as she remembered how far they'd come from that rainy night at Henderson's. Inside, the space was buzzing with activity. The restaurant would open its doors to the public in just 2 hours, but it wasn't like any other restaurant in the city. The tables were a mix of elegant and casual, some with white tablecloths, others with cheerful checkered patterns. The walls featured artwork from local artists, many of whom had once been homeless themselves. Everything ready for opening day? Mr. Washington asked, appearing beside her. In the past year, he'd become more than a boss. He was a mentor, a friend, and sometimes even the grandfather figure she'd lost years ago. Almost, and he smiled, watching the staff prepare for the day. The unique thing about the Welcome Table was its workforce. Half of the employees were former fine dining professionals like Chef Wilson, who'd left Henderson's to join their project. The other half were people who'd never been given a chance in the restaurant industry before, former homeless individuals, refugees, people who'd struggled to find work because of how they'd looked or where they came from. Remember to breathe, Mr. Washington chuckled. You've trained them well. Amy watched as Lei Wei, a former homeless man who'd shown an incredible talent for service, expertly arranged flowers at each table. Nearby, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd fled her country with nothing but hope, was teaching a younger server the proper way to fold napkins. They all wore the same uniform, simple black pants and crisp white shirts with a small gold pin that read "Dignity Serves." The kitchen door swung open and Chef Wilson emerged, followed by his diverse team. The menu they'd created was as unique as the restaurant itself, a blend of fine dining techniques with comfort food prices. No one would be turned away for ordering just coffee, and there was a pay-what-you-can option hidden discreetly at the bottom of each menu. Look who's here. Mr. Washington nodded toward the door. Amy turned to see Mr. Peterson walking in, looking somewhat nervous. After the changes at Henderson's, he'd gone through a transformation of his own. Now he volunteered as a consultant for the Dignity Project, helping other restaurants understand the value of inclusive service. I had to see it for myself, he said, looking around the space with genuine admiration. It's beautiful, Emmy. You've created something special here. We all did, she corrected gently. Everyone deserves a second chance. That's what the Welcome Table is all about. The front doors opened, and the first group of staff members from the morning shift began arriving. Emmy smiled as she watched them greet each other. The former bank executive who'd lost everything in the recession now worked alongside a young woman who'd lived in her car until the Dignity Project found her. Here, their pasts didn't matter. What mattered was their shared commitment to treating every guest with respect. Time for the morning meeting, Emmy announced, gathering everyone in the main dining room. They formed a circle, no hierarchy here, just people supporting each other. Today, she began, we're not just opening a restaurant, we're opening doors. Some of you know what it feels like to be judged by your appearance, to be told you don't belong. Others have worked in places that did the judging. But here, everyone belongs. She pulled out a familiar napkin, the one that had started it all. A year of handling had softened its edges, but the words remained clear. Kindness, when the world expects none, is the truest test of character. Mr. Washington wrote these words to me when I was just a waitress who chose to be kind, she continued. I didn't know then that he was a successful lawyer and businessman. I just knew he was a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity. That's what we'll offer everyone who walks through these doors, not just a meal, but a place where they're seen, valued, and welcomed. The staff nodded, many with tears in their eyes. They'd all been through the training program Emmy had developed, learning not just service skills, but the deeper meaning of hospitality. As they broke into their preparation duties, Emmy walked through the restaurant one last time. Each table had a small card that read, "At this table, you are welcome. Your worth is not measured by what you can afford, but by your inherent dignity as a human being." The host's stand held a special reservation book. Unlike other restaurants, it didn't track guests' spending habits or status. Instead, it noted food allergies, accessibility needs, and whether someone might need extra time with the menu. Real hospitality, Emmy had learned, was about making everyone feel comfortable, not just the wealthy. At exactly 11 o'clock a.m., Emmy stood by the doors, ready to welcome their first guests. Through the glass, she could see people already lining up, some in business suits, others in work clothes, a few who looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. All would be welcomed. All would be served with dignity. "Ready?" Mr. Washington asked, standing beside her. Emmy thought about that rainy night at Henderson's, about how a simple choice to be kind had led to all of this. She thought about all the lives that would be touched by what they'd created here, not just the guests, but the staff who'd found purpose and community. "Ready?" She smiled, reaching for the door. As she pulled it open, the morning sunlight streamed in, warm and bright, like hope made visible. The welcome table was more than just a restaurant. It was proof that one person's kindness could spark a movement, that change was possible, and that everyone deserved a place at the table. A new chapter was beginning, not just for Emmy, but for everyone who would walk through these doors. And somewhere in the city, a simple napkin with a message about kindness had started it all.